Morning. I just want to say thanks to Ian and the Cavernoma Alliance for asking me to come and speak today. So just to explain, so obviously I work in the National Hospital. I work with adults with a variety of neurological conditions, including cavernoma. And I suppose the nature of my work often is, cognitive and neuropsychological assessment and intervention, and also working with people in terms of adjustment and managing conditions. So some of my predecessors have spoken on this day before, who have gone into more detail on things like the cognitive effects of cavernoma and also kind of cognitive behavior therapy ideas in relation to coping with cavernoma. Today I'm going to step back a bit and do kind of an overview in terms of the work that I do with neurological patients and the nature of psychological adjustment. So what I'm going to start with is kind of explaining a bit more about the concept of what we're talking about when we talk about adjustment. Also the challenges within cavernoma itself, what's particular to the condition and the diagnosis of cavernoma that can present challenges to the individual in terms of coping and managing the stress. And also the nature of, adjustment when things get stuck, when we're finding that after the initial period where we're managing things that we're finding that we're feeling low in mood or anxious, and that's not lifting, even though we're trying to do our best to manage, and to try and look into that a little bit more and how that it can affect us and what we can do about it. So kind of starting off in terms of what do we mean when we talk about adjustment, and I suppose this is something that's not particular to people with neurological conditions, not particular to people even with physical health problems. It's something that we all face in our lifetime in different challenges, where we're moving home, having children, getting married, bereavement, all of these things that arrive into our lives that challenge us in different ways, that we have to find ways to cope and manage, to work through those things, to find a way of managing that in our lives. And I suppose it's kind of adapting to changing conditions. It's also the sense of in physical illness. Often when people manage and adjust to conditions, they feel less distressed. It doesn't mean they don't feel distressed, but they manage that in a way that they can move on with particular goals in their lives, and their expectations are more matched to what they feel they can manage day to day. So often the process of that is acknowledgement of the feelings and the difficult emotions that we have, to a point that we feel less overwhelmed by things, and that's in a sense trying to minimize the impact of physical, emotional and cognitive changes. So we're not saying that when people manage and adjust, these things aren't there, but it's just that sense of working through a process where people can feel that they're in a better place to cope with the challenges that they have. So with regard to cavernoma itself, just even looking from the list of symptoms on the NHS website, and I suppose everyone here is living with that condition and is very aware of these things, but I suppose I'm talking about them in the context of the particular adjustment challenges that they bring. Obviously people have medical interventions initially, but often over time managing the effects of things. For example, managing the effect of a hemorrhage and the effects that can have on our physical functioning, and also talking to some people at the dinner last night, even in terms of managing seizures, of the things on an ongoing basis. So these things are a constant reminder to someone of a sense of vulnerability, that it's not just I get a diagnosis and I move on, that every day I'm having to live with and manage particular challenges related to that diagnosis. And in one sense that's the physical symptom, but also the experience of that symptom is a constant reminder of a sense of vulnerability and a sense of I'm kind of not the same as I was. And obviously a whole range of neurological conditions such as balance problems, double vision, and also fatigue, memory problems. So a huge array of different things that people are living with over time, that it's not just they get diagnosed, have a medical procedure and move on. A lot of these things are things people are managing on an ongoing basis. And it's not just the physical symptoms, the nature of, and I see this in patients that I see through the neuro-oncology service as well, that each of the treatment interventions, or even the not treatment, the watch and wait, where someone's monitoring a patient over time, brings its own challenges. So for example, with medication, people managing side effects with regard to surgery, whether that be neurosurgery or stereotactic radiosurgery, different interventions, having to go through that and the effects of that. But often it's the watch and wait, the sense of having to manage and tolerate a degree of anxiety and uncertainty. And particularly with cavernoma patients, it's that sense of often something can happen. There could be a bleed at a particular time, but I'm being monitored and I'm being followed up. And I suppose when you think of psychological adjustment, it requires the patient to manage a degree of uncertainty and anxiety on an ongoing basis. So each of the treatment interventions brings its own challenges in that way. So I'm going to frame the talk as I go through in these different areas, and I'm going to start off just talking about, all of these areas kind of interact in terms of how people cope and adjust. So we're looking at physical, cognitive, emotional factors, and all of these occur in a social context, in an environment, depending on work situations, families. So there's lots of different factors that kind of interact. So it's often very complex, the different ways people end up coping and managing this condition. So I think in terms of emotional adjustment, just from the starting point, the changes in people's lives, I know it's very different for different people, but in general, it's that sense of a change in functioning, a change in daily routine, lifestyle. So, for example, seizures, other neurological symptoms may mean that limits our life a bit more, that we can't do as much as we've done before. We have to suddenly change our routines. For example, there may be activities day to day. For example, people may not be able to work full-time, working part-time due to fatigue, other symptoms. And I suppose all of that knock-on effect in terms of our relationships. For example, whether it's in a caregiving role, having children in a family routine, that suddenly you're not able to sustain all of that, you need more help or assistance, and the change in dynamics between relationships because of that. So a lot of different areas of life, even with one or two symptoms that limit someone even a little, can require an adjustment in lots of different areas. But in thinking about what happens in that process of diagnosis and initially working through that, I think the reason with these first few slides particularly, it's to kind of stress that we don't want to pathologize, or we don't want to say that because people feel difficult emotions as a result of an initial diagnosis that there's something abnormal or unusual about that. I think it's quite important to say that it's okay. It's important actually to recognize the difficult emotions that people can feel, and part of that process can help people heal and process and make sense of things. So even the experience of loss, thinking of the previous slide, all the different changes that happen, and the experience of loss related to that changes, and that can bring up a huge amount for people in terms of that sense of shock, fear, denial. Often people can feel angry and frustrated too, in the sense of I can't do things the same way I used to, and that sense of not meeting your own or others' expectations. And I suppose it's trying to work through that to get to a period of acknowledging or accepting some of those limitations so you can adapt and try and work around them. And I was saying to people last night, one of the terms that patients have said to me a huge amount is the term the kind of new normal. So it's a way they've made sense of those changes and losses and I suppose try to frame it in a positive sense. It's kind of acknowledging that there are losses, that there are differences, but the sense of now I need to work around this day to day as best I can to live the best life that I can in the circumstances. And that's difficult and painful. It's not a straightforward process, but it's that sense of trying to feel that your life is more controllable, and I suppose part of that process is acknowledging the loss and also managing your own expectations of yourself. So sometimes I think when things get very stuck, there can be that sense of the old me and the new me with regard to when something happens. And often, when I've seen people in a therapeutic process, it's often not that simple, but when people feel stuck, it can feel very black and white with regard to being able to do everything before the diagnosis and feeling quite hopeless afterwards. So I think it's that process of finding ways to manage and process those emotions, to work towards kind of beginning to build your life and work around these difficulties. And I think uncertainty, again, like I was talking earlier on with the possibility of bleeding and hemorrhage with cavernoma, that's very much something that people have to live with, and that's extremely challenging. You know, the sense of, I have to find a way to continue to do as much as I can, but I can never be certain that around the corner something may or may not happen. And it's, you know, again, managing, tolerating that uncertainty and managing a degree of anxiety. And at times, for patients, when I've talked to them, they feel that they're managing that quite well, but at other times they can feel completely overwhelmed. And I suppose, again, when I talk a bit more about anxiety, it's more the concern is when that gets a bit stuck. You know, it's understandable that people can feel that way at times, but it's more the concern is when that gets to a point where that's affecting someone over and above what we'd expect in terms of the symptoms and that they're managing day to day in terms of impacting on their functioning. So the question is, how should I be feeling? There is no right way in managing these things. In years of working with people managing various neurological conditions, the one thing I've learned, it's so personal how someone copes and what it is that people draw on in terms of their resilience, other things that maybe are problematic and get in the way. There's no general textbook for saying this is how you manage things. It is very personal. But, you know, the nature of adjustment, you know, can be positive and negative. People can find a way, for example, working through significant changes and diagnoses and find that they prioritize things in their lives. For example, some patients have found that they were kind of working too hard, not having enough time for family, and because of the limitations, they've readjusted their priorities and it's made them reflect on their lives. And in a sense, there can be aspects of that that can be positive for the individual and the people around them. But it's important to distinguish what's, and I put it in inverted commas, normal adjustment, but the sense of adjustment that's just working through something, and something that then becomes a bit stuck, where we're kind of seeing that actually there are things there that are over and above the effect of the illness, the diagnosis, that are getting in the way of people moving on with their lives. So I suppose obviously in the first sense it's low mood and depression, and it's a real balance here, a bit like earlier when I was talking about that sense that we don't want to pathologize, we don't want to overly, you know, jump in with interventions when actually sometimes people need space to work through things, but at the same time it's that balance between not ignoring when something is persistent and is affecting someone more. So, you know, often depression is very common after brain injury, and it's more severe than just feeling down about what's happened. It's beginning, you know, it can be something that occurs later on. Often the emotional impact, there's so much focus on the medical interventions at an early phase if something's happening, that it's kind of later on that more of the emotional factors come to the fore, and that's when things like this can be more obvious. So, and we're saying it occurs kind of independently of the severity of the condition, so it's not feeling down. You know, any studies is not saying that someone who has worse symptoms will have more low mood. It can be just more the mismatch between expectations of yourself and managing your levels of functioning and the reality of what you're having to do day to day. So in terms of what causes depression, you know, again, we get back thinking of the diagram I put up earlier, a lot of factors interacting in terms of biological, psychological, social factors. So, you know, with regard to things like cavernoma or other brain tumors, other neurological conditions, there can be the location of things in the brain. For example, we know that, you know, areas in the brain like the limbic system can affect our emotions, and sometimes when that's affected, there can be an organic reason for changes that's over and above just managing the condition. But often, the more I've worked with people, it's seeing kind of the history. How do people cope with other things in their life? Long before diagnosis of cavernoma, what's their personality and coping style? How have they managed things throughout their life? Because sometimes when something comes in that we suddenly are thrown into and have to manage and have to cope with, it kind of pushes our buttons in the sense, what are the things that are challenging for me in working through this, and the limitations and the changes that it brings. But other things like social support, level of disability, they're very real factors in terms of what's around us. So, for example, sometimes working through things, people can have a very, very tight-knit support network that can sustain them through that and may not need to avail of professional help. Even if things are stuck, they may find that through friends and family that kind of gets them through that period and enables them to kind of rebuild their lives. But again, the symptoms are that kind of persistent feelings of helplessness, worthlessness, loss of self-esteem, and just when the emotions aren't resolving, a bit like the emotions we were talking about, the loss and transition, but they're persistent, they're not resolving, and they're leading to, when we talk about the social and occupational functioning, for example, for patients, sometimes it might be a case of patients that are feeling low in mood because of experiencing seizures, they're more isolated, they're not going out, whereas it may be physically possible for them to do a little bit more, but because of the low mood, it means that they isolate themselves and avoid things more, and that then becomes more of an issue and a problem over time. And also things like fatigue and cognitive deficits, when people are low in mood, it can exacerbate both of those conditions, which often are present with neurological illnesses. So just to give an example of a cavernoma patient that I saw, again, with this particular patient, it was a cavernoma that affected mobility and speech, but it was the context of, this was someone who had dealt with illnesses earlier in their life, had already rebuilt their life to an extent, but the recovery was not happening as fast as they wanted, and also the social effects were that suddenly from working independently, they had to move back home, were more dependent on their parents, and they just talked of that sense of feeling useless. So again, it touches on a few of the things that we were talking earlier, the expectations that I have an idea, I want to get, recover to this level, but it's not happening. And I suppose it's processing that sense of loss and disability, and actually just recognizing how difficult it was for this person in terms of the changes in their life, having to be more dependent, having worked their way up and become independent, and being incredibly resilient actually. And I suppose in terms of intervention with this person, they were, as we're a specialist hospital, they went on to a community team who worked in more detail to try and set up, for example, in a functional way, trying to get someone involved in work in some capacity, to give them a structure, help them engage socially, and also just having ongoing support and people to help that person get up to the best place that they could. But obviously, it's not straightforward, and it's a long road, but they were beginning to feel better in their mood when I reviewed them some months on, because they were beginning to connect with work, other things, getting back to some sense of a structure in their life, and also just some of their self-esteem back. So again, it's working with the individual in the system too, and trying to link so people feel they have a role, they have goals to work towards. And for him, that definitely made a difference, even though we're not saying that he didn't have more disability after the cavernoma, but there was that sense of hope once they were supported and helped engage with things. So again, in terms of coping with depression, there's basic recommendations in terms of just our sense of self-care. And this applies to all of us, having a degree of exercise, appropriate rest, diet, just generally caring for ourselves day to day. That sense of talking about our feelings and emotions with family or friends, and that's tricky sometimes, because I know for patients, when they feel they're holding a lot, they worry about being a burden and talking to family. And I suppose the only way you can tell over time is seeing, is that something that becomes more manageable for the patient, or whether they actually do need a space and talking therapies separate to family to be able to talk through some difficult issues. And just, again, physical activity improves our mood, and just reducing isolation. And I think the thing about depression is it often gives us a filter where it's, we can only see things in a negative way. And sometimes getting out of that is sometimes doing things even when we don't feel like it, socializing, doing activity, and eventually things pick up over time. And sometimes it's about talking with medical professionals about medication interventions if necessary. But I know a lot of patients try to work through things first, but sometimes resources are limited, and it is necessary for them to talk further about that as an option. So again, with anxiety, again, getting back to listing of the physical symptoms, a huge amount, the lack of control, the vulnerability with managing things like seizures, loss of role, independence, uncertainty, impact on relationships. So again, it's more, none of these things are unusual or abnormal. These are just real anxieties that people are trying to manage, but it becomes more problematic when it's out of proportion or goes on too long. So anxiety, by its very nature, kind of prepares ourselves to manage a threat, but when it becomes overgeneralized, it kind of unnecessarily limits people's lives. And so again, for example, people experiencing seizures, the sense of not going outside because of having had a seizure, and then that isolates people, and anxiety and low mood can be maintained and become more problematic. So, and it's tricky, because normally, for example, in cognitive behavior therapy, the treatment for anxiety is very much kind of facing things and building up kind of graded exposure. We often challenge things behaviorally, but there is an element that with seizures there can be a small risk, but it's the sense of balancing that with the effect on your life as a whole, and not letting that unnecessarily restrict you in things that are potentially possible to do. So again, it's important to reduce avoidance. There's a lot of literature now talking more and more about mindfulness, as a technique, and particularly in managing kind of physical illness. And this is something that can be, either through classes or people do individually themselves. I have another slide in a second giving more information. But just engaging in other activities that give us enjoyment. So sometimes when we're managing uncertainty, other ongoing anxieties, just making sure we have enough in our life that we can focus on, in a sense that our whole identity isn't connected with the diagnosis and the illness, that we have enough going on in the rest of our lives as well that give us some distraction from that. But with mindfulness, again, it's been shown to kind of enable relaxation, improve quality of life for people with neurological illnesses, and lots of studies talking about how it can help with stress and coping and well-being. So one of the links I've put at the bottom there is this headspace.com. I don't know if anyone has used that, but it's something that patients have used. And again, there may be other things that you find out about. There may be mindfulness classes locally, but this is one that it actually has an app that you can do on an iPhone or an iPad, and there are mindfulness exercises on it. And I know of patients that have found that very helpful, and then they can build that into their routine and structure during the week. So, to kind of empower patients to do something for themselves, using that website has been very useful for people. It's not for everyone, but I think it's about exploring those options and seeing if it works for you. So I'm going to talk briefly about the cognitive impact in the context of adjustment, but I know this has been covered in previous talks, so I'm not going to go into as much detail. But again, the effect of a cavernoma on our thinking skills, with pressure, with bleeding in areas of the brain, and also with treatment interventions. All of those things can have an effect on our thinking skills, and I suppose cognition is something that has an impact on our quality of life as well. It's another aspect in terms of functioning. It might mean that we're less independent, that we have to change roles. All of those areas related to adjustment connect with cognition as well. So it can depend on the size, the location of the cavernoma. But also what's important is when people are low in mood and anxious, people can feel more foggy, and that can sometimes mean that, you know, attention and concentration, if there are very mild cognitive deficits, it can be exacerbated by that, and also with fatigue. So I suppose it's the point of, in managing adjustment, looking at what are the controllable or changeable factors. Some things aren't changeable, but if I can manage things and look after myself in terms of my mood, you know, maybe that can help minimize some of the other difficulties, even things like cognition and fatigue. So obviously it varies in severity, and it can have an impact on work, relationships, and some of the things can be temporary. So often in the process of recovering from surgery, it's quite normal for people to feel very sluggish, slowed down in that recovery process, and a lot of that can improve over time. But for others, it can be more persistent, and again, that depends on where the cavernoma is located. You know, if there has been a bleed, how has it impacted on things? So, but the main thing is that cognition can impact on our quality of life, and it's the sense of doing what we can to cope with those. So when we do neuropsychological cognitive assessments, we're looking at people's strengths and weaknesses, looking at strategies to manage adjustments in the home and work environment. And this is working also with our community colleagues with occupation. I know there's an occupational therapist talking later, that we often liaise with them in terms of recommendations and working more intensively with patients to try and manage and work around these difficulties in the home environment. But the main thing is that in the research, it's often compensatory strategies rather than kind of specific brain training techniques are recommended in terms of managing adjustment related to cognitive changes. And that's mainly because people can become very good on particular brain training tasks, but they're not necessarily generalizable to all areas of functioning day to day, and often it's more productive to kind of work around those things. And I'll give an example of a cavernoma patient who presented with short-term memory problems, felt slowed down in their processing, and also, you know, planning and organization. They got kind of muddled, particularly when there was a few tasks going on at the same time. So they needed to adjust. You know, there was no easy answer when they were feeling slowed down, but just managing their own expectations sometimes and needing more time. So when people are in a work environment, it maybe, you know, it's not always possible, but for the employer to allow more time, or when people are doing exams, you know, the sense of they need more time to think, and when they do, they can minimize some of the other difficulties. With this patient, she was more likely to make errors and feel overwhelmed if she tried to do things too quickly. And again, you know, the use of verbal and visual memory aids, you know, such as a notebook, smartphone reminders, calendars, just anything to help take that burden off day to day. And I suppose the key thing in terms of psychological adjustment with that is, over time, people kind of internalize that, and once they build that into the structure and routine of their day, it becomes less conscious that they're actually managing those deficits, because they have their key strategies around them that they rely on, and it becomes just part of how they, you know, do their routine day to day. So also with structure and routine and trying to do one task at a time was another thing that helped this particular individual cope better. So the last thing in terms of physical changes in cavernoma, and this is something when I've worked with different, you know, patients who are dealing with stroke or neuro-oncology, brain tumor, so many different neurological conditions that they talk of fatigue as being one of the most distressing aspects because of the nature of not being able to see. Other people can't see what they're experiencing day to day, and it's not a sense of tiredness, it's more, it's a quite distressing state that people can get in, you know, sometimes just mentally having to make more effort, but also just the physical effects of neurological conditions, the physical side effects can mean that it's, you know, it's a persistent thing people have to live with. They have to change the way they live their life and do things. to help manage and cope with that better. And I suppose the thing that we try and work with patients is managing a kind of boom and bust cycle. And this is, well, if you think about it, going through, if you're feeling tired and you're trying to get better, it's quite normal to want to just kind of push yourself, get back to normal. I want to just push myself really hard because I want to become as independent as I can. And that's what's so challenging psychologically sometimes with fatigue, because that can actually cause more distress sometimes if people aren't quite ready to do that. So you end up with a pattern where someone's doing a lot one day when they feel good, and then the next day they feel completely wiped out. And that kind of up and down pattern is very psychologically challenging, because it means then that other things like low mood, people can feel quite hopeless when they have those down days. Whereas actually you're trying to get a sustainable activity level where you're trying to get to a point where you're doing a little bit each day rather than a lot and then nothing. And I think that helps people manage, their distress better. But part of that is managing the loss and transition too, because it's a process of saying, well, I can't do as much as I would have done before, so I have to find a way to do as much as I feel able and listen to my body. But this is where sometimes in therapy, when I've worked with people, when they're used to being busy, they define themselves by being busy and in a role in work, and we can all be guilty of this in today's world, where it's constant, busyness and doing and having to stop or slow down and take rests. It can be a really challenging thing to do. People can understand the logic of it, but the process of doing that in terms of psychological adjustment can be very challenging. So again, fatigue may fluctuate. For some it reduces over time, for others it's an ongoing issue. And I think if things continue to get in the way, that sometimes psychological support does help patients manage that better. And again, I work with individuals, so I don't, because of service restraints, we don't have the capacity to work with families or the wider system, but obviously even working with the individual, you're very aware that we're not talking about people in a vacuum here. People are in context in their work, families, where something like this has a knock-on effect for everyone in terms of partners, children, extended family, the impact of negotiating changes in work as well, and the sense of how much do I tell people or not tell people about it, reactions, some friends, with patients can step up and be a support, and that can be a pleasant surprise, others can drift away. And also the nature of how people react to that. So people want to be positive and give reassurance, but how that can be complex sometimes. So that can feel, for example, a patient might say that they're feeling fatigued or tired, and that even when people are trying to be positive, that can be experienced by the patient as kind of dismissive or lacking understanding. So I think it's sometimes trying to find the right way, and also for patients themselves learning a language to be able to say how they want to be supported and communicating in a way, and this is for the patient themselves and those around them, to manage those changes. And sometimes they may need external support, but unfortunately with regard to service restrictions, it's often, in adult services, difficult to work with the whole system and the whole family. So unfortunately it can mean kind of partners or the people going to the GP independently and getting support for themselves. And also there can be behavioural change, cognitive change, and the impact on relationships, and the pressure to be strong and get on with things when you're managing lots of difficult emotions and significant changes in function and day-to-day life, daily routines. And it's, I suppose, the sense of it's okay not, to find that sometimes you find things difficult and you feel overwhelmed. It's just that sense of the pressure people can put on themselves. I should be coping, I should be managing. And often that can get in the way of support and talking through with those close to you to find a way together to cope with what they're managing. And in terms of neurorehabilitation, it's thinking about, thinking about goals, I suppose, within working through all of this, what's important to me. And I know there's new therapies of working with patients in the last 10 or 15 years, which very much focus as an acceptance and commitment therapy, talks a lot about values. And this is sometimes in context of people with terminal illness as well, in the sense of getting to the crux of what's important to someone. What's meaningful for you? What are the values that you have? What is it, if your life is more limited, what's important to you? Being a good parent, being successful at work, maintaining friendships, supporting other people. What are the key elements for you that keep you going? And I think having goals, particularly in neurorehabilitation, even when people are working with loss of independence and limitations, that can give people hope and give people something to work towards. So again, with all of this, the road to recovery, and in a way with cavernoma often it can be open-ended. It's just ongoing monitoring, and you never quite know, but you kind of see your neurologist, there's an updated scan, and they're monitoring to see if there's any changes. But it's the ups and downs of that road, and it's trying to utilize what strategies you can to help you best cope. But there's no right way, it's very personal, and like in other areas of life, when we face obstacles or challenges, it's trying to use those experiences to learn from and to work through. But through all of this, acknowledging that difficult emotions can come up, and it's that sense of not pushing them away, but acknowledging that and trying to work through them so you can get to a point in your life where there's enough going on that you're not defined by your illness, that you still feel you're living and you have a good quality of life. And this is an example of just quotes from various support groups we've done for different neurological conditions, but it's just an example of the kind of things people have said in a positive sense. And this is in the context of managing significant disability, changes, less independence, and that people find that they, through goals and also the sense of reprioritizing in their life, that there are things people can identify from what is a difficult experience to draw on and help keep them going. And just the last thing, again, sources of support, and I'm very aware, and I had conversations with some people at the dinner last night about the limitations of services. We all feel that, particularly with psychological support, that it should be more widely available, but often it's very limited. And within our service, often, with external patients, the best we can offer, GPs can refer for a cognitive assessment, and we can give people strategies and advice. But in terms of ongoing work, it's often through the GP with different psychological therapies. But I also think that, support groups and organizations like today, in terms of peer support, I know that's not, everything, and sometimes people do need something in addition to that, but I also think it's incredibly valuable and powerful to have people share their experiences in the context of the talk that we've done today. Having a day like this where people can come together and talk to each other and compare these things and talk about the challenges together is in this day and age where there are limitations sometimes on what services can offer. It makes organizations like the Cavernoma Alliance more valuable than ever in terms of connecting people together to share these experiences to help them adjust and cope. There are other self-help resources through the NHS website and other things. The LondonMemoryClinic.com has advice on cognitive difficulties and managing that. But in summary, really, cavernoma brings a significant amount of challenges in our physical, emotional, cognitive functioning. And it is a period of transition, hearing stories of when it's discovered or when there's a bleed and someone's trying to manage that and the changes that brings. It's normalizing the emotions that people feel at that time. And there can be profound changes, loss, transition. But I suppose it's the sense of asking for help if you feel things have got stuck, if you feel that things are affecting you over and above the effect of the illness itself. So like I said earlier on with seizures or the things where it does restrict your life, but when you're restricted over and above that, and it means that there are obstacles to kind of rebuilding things and beginning to do things in your life, it's being able to ask for help. And that might be through friends and family. It doesn't have to always be a psychologist or a counsellor, but it's just being able to talk about it when you get to that point. And you know, obviously some people here have managed to work through with peer support with family, friends, and that's great. But just ask for help should you need it. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burke, very much indeed.
Right.
And we only have one microphone, I'm afraid, which Roxana will use. But any questions to Dr. Burke? Please raise your hand.
Yeah.
One question.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, wondering if everyone else can. One question I have is there any evidence that an increase in stress and anxiety can itself bring about the symptoms, for example, seizures, from a cavernoma?
You know, again, a neurologist would be better placed to answer that. Like, I think through my experience of seeing people with seizures, that when they're already experiencing seizures, you know, extremely stressful periods can have an impact. But, you know, so I think in a general sense, it's talking about, you know, getting back to that general management of stress and anxiety. I think it definitely can't do any harm in terms of managing seizures, that you try and get support, you know, with those things, because when people are under severe periods of stress, it can sometimes and I'm talking anecdotally, a neurologist will be able to give more figures in terms of from a medical perspective, but I think I have seen sometimes patients, you know, the incidence increase when they're under severe stress. So I think in the sense of looking after yourself, getting support and help, you know, anyway, to help you manage, you know, you want to be in the best place possible that you can manage seizures when they occur. But I think very, you know, extreme stress can have an impact sometimes. But again, that's just me talking anecdotally, and neurologists will give more of a medical opinion in terms of the research and other things. But I have seen that in some patients.
Anybody else?
This covered a huge range, and I'm going to focus on one thing.
Yeah.
You know, you picked up an intervention like neurosurgery, and a feeling like anxiety and fear. And so with that specific example, so I'm going to pick that up because I remember experiencing that, you know, truly strongly. And so there was a situation where you have, you know, something very specific in a short, maybe few month time period. And I always say this whenever I go to any kind of workshops and stuff, never underestimate the power of anxiety to be so overwhelming. And I'm picking up, you know, what would you do in a situation like that? You say, oh, ask for help. And I got lots of help.
But are you talking before surgery or in the recovery?
Well, both,
after?
really. Both really. And I got fantastic peer help from someone sitting next to me. Yeah. I got reassurance from GP, from neurosurgeon. But then, so this is me personally, and I'm not talking about my personal example, just as a case study. Yeah. But then what do you do in a situation? Is that like cognitive therapy? Is that like, you say ask help? It's kind of hard to ask help sometimes when you're in the throes. I just think that, you know, should there be somebody on board in the team? But I mean, what do you do for someone?
Well, I think I suppose what I would do first when someone would come to me is trying to explore what the anxiety is about. You know, so for example, you know, there may be understandable anxiety prior to neurosurgery, that sometimes just having a space to talk in general and family and friends around can get people through that period. But it's more about, again, like I was saying in the talk, if it persists, if it's problematic for someone, it's, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy is evidence-based, you know, that's often the treatment of choice in terms of managing anxiety, you know, through GPs, through local services. But I suppose, you know, the first thing I would do if someone came to me, it would be exploring with them what the anxiety is about. You know, because there might be a surface level, it's about neurosurgery, but it's really sometimes exploring that in more depth with someone, because it can be surprising. You know, that someone can say it's about neurosurgery and then you explore further and it can connect with deeper and meaningful things for someone. So it's not always what you think, even the patient themselves thinks initially.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
One more.
One more.
And Facebook.
Oh.
I have one question for myself and then one from you. So my question, can you hear me? Yeah. My question is techniques for sensory overload and sensory issues. Is that something that you can find in neuropsychology?
And can you give an example in what sense?
So a lot of our members and myself struggle with things like in a busy restaurant, for example, noise going in the background. With being out in busy crowds, or are there techniques that are available through neuropsychology to cope with those things, or do you have to go down a different avenue?
Well, I think again, it's exploring the nature of that. So for example, sometimes with noise in crowds, it's so common for patients to talk about that. It's a question of how there can be an understandable level of distress because of the physical effects of going through surgery or treatment. That means people are much more sensitive, and that's not necessarily sometimes a psychological issue. It is actually sometimes psychoeducation, working with people and explaining that there are elements of that that actually are physical changes that mean that someone has a sensitivity to that. And I think it's looking at, is that something that's leading to avoidance of things that unnecessarily restrict someone's life, or sometimes it's working through techniques where, if there are techniques like grounding or focusing on things or working through so someone can get through a particular situation they have to, other times it might be talking about the necessity for space, that someone needs to step away and take themselves out of an environment for a period of time. And it's exploring in the particular situation what's best for people. So I suppose there are elements of that that could need psychological intervention, in terms of how someone is coping and managing with that. But sometimes when I'm talking to patients about it, it's the sense of actually, it's just educating on the effects, the physical effects sometimes, that it's not actually sometimes about you being anxious or a psychological reaction, that it can actually feel distressing, noise or crowds to people, and it's about how do I manage that as best as possible. And sometimes that is kind of stepping away from the situation for a period of time when people get overwhelmed. So I don't want to generalize, but again, and there can be techniques, again, through mindfulness, other things. I would recommend exploring some of those things as well, which help people kind of moment to moment manage anxious feelings, and I think that's what's been very helpful with some of the apps and other things. So actually I'd recommend exploring some of those for that in-moment kind of management of anxiety.
And the question we have from home is if you could comment further on benefits of art therapy, if you have any comment on that, and how that can help patients.
Well, I'm a bit biased because my wife is an art psychotherapist. So, it's not something I do myself, but obviously I'm very aware of the benefits of art psychotherapy. And I think, again, I've talked, because of my experience of working with patients, mainly about talking therapies, but obviously the effects of neurological conditions, verbal talking therapies isn't always the answer. And the effects on speech are the things that not just because of the nature of the therapy, but because of the nature of the physical effects of neurological conditions, that sometimes art therapy may be an extremely productive way of working through and processing emotions. It doesn't have to be always in terms of talking therapies or in an oral way. But other times it might be just people find they can express themselves more, even when there aren't speech difficulties, other things that can be through non-verbal means that they can express themselves emotionally in different ways. And to be honest, I think whatever works for the person, and I think art therapy can be really, really powerful. So yes, I think that is another way of working through it.
I'd like to say thank you very much
All right.
indeed, Dr. Burke. Thank you.
Okay.